September 20th, 1985, Santa Fe, New Mexico. At 20:47 hours, an FBI surveillance team files a routine notation. Subject exiting residence through rear door. The subject is Edward Lee Howard, age 34, once trained by the CIA's Directorate of Operations for one of the most dangerous assignments in the Cold War, Moscow Station. Personnel files recorded proficiency in surveillance detection routes, clandestine communication protocols, and dead drop operations designed for a city saturated with KGB counterintelligence. Expectation: an ex-CIA officer under investigation could not evade federal monitoring. Reality: the next entries in the FBI logs are gaps. Howard performs a fully developed CIA-style surveillance detection route, breaks visual contact, and vanishes. By September 22nd, scattered evidence places him moving south toward the Mexican border. Weeks later, reports from a KGB defector confirm what Washington feared: Howard had crossed into the Soviet Union. The United States had just lost the only CIA case officer in history to defect successfully to Moscow. In 1980, the CIA's Directorate of Operations selected Edward Lee Howard for an assignment reserved for the agency's most capable officers, Moscow Station. Personnel Evaluation Report 8231 listed him as a candidate suitable for denied area placement. Bureaucratic language for one of the most counterintelligence intense postings in American intelligence. Moscow Station operated inside a city where every street corner, telephone line, and hotel corridor existed under KGB observation. Officers assigned there required fluency in tradecraft designed to function under constant surveillance. Course records from Howard's training show completion of surveillance detection routes, multi-hour patterns of movement designed to expose hostile watchers. He learned brush-pass techniques for exchanging materials without stopping. He practiced dead drop concealment using CIA standard containers engineered to blend into urban environments. He studied OWVL protocols, one-way voice link communications that allowed officers to transmit messages without requiring a response that might compromise the receiver. The training was comprehensive, detailed, and built on decades of operational experience in Moscow's hostile intelligence environment. The expectation within the directorate was clear. Howard represented a stable, technically skilled officer capable of handling high-risk operations in the world's most hostile intelligence environment. Moscow Station assignments were rare. The posting carried prestige within the Directorate of Operations. Officers selected for Moscow typically represented the top tier of case officers, individuals with proven judgment, operational discipline, and psychological stability necessary for work under constant KGB surveillance. The reality, documented in internal memoranda later declassified, told a different story. Security assessments noted instability indicators and concerns about personal conduct. Behavioral evaluations flagged tendencies that, in retrospect, would have justified closer scrutiny. Supervisors documented minor incidents, nothing that individually warranted termination, but collectively suggesting a pattern of questionable judgment. The Security Division raised concerns. Those concerns were noted, filed, and ultimately overridden by operational necessity and institutional momentum. The CIA needed officers for Moscow. Howard had completed the training. His technical proficiency was documented. The decision moved forward despite the warning signals embedded in his personnel file. It was a decision that balanced immediate operational needs against potential long-term security risks, a calculation that, in Howard's case, proved catastrophically wrong. The institutional pressure to fill critical positions overseas sometimes overwhelmed the caution that security protocols were designed to enforce. The training itself represented significant investment. Howard had received instruction in surveillance detection methods that took years to develop and refine. He understood how the KGB operated in Moscow, what technical capabilities Soviet counterintelligence possessed, and what vulnerabilities CIA operations accepted as necessary risks. This knowledge made him valuable as an officer. It also made him dangerous as a potential security risk. The CIA advanced a candidate already marked with early caution flags, By March of 1983, those caution flags had evolved into security alarms that could no longer be ignored. Polygraph Worksheet 83-221 registered inconclusive and deceptive indicators during questions related to drug use. The polygraph examiner's notes, preserved in Howard's personnel file, documented responses that deviated from baseline patterns established in earlier clearance reviews. The deviations were significant enough to trigger mandatory follow-up examination protocols. A second polygraph examination produced similar results. The questions focused on drug use, petty theft, and personal conduct, standard security clearance review topics designed to identify potential vulnerabilities to blackmail or coercion. Howard's responses on drug-related questions showed consistent physiological markers that polygraph examiners associated with deception or significant anxiety. The technical readouts alone were not conclusive. Polygraph technology has well-documented limitations, but combined with other indicators, they formed a concerning pattern. Internal security reports compiled over the following months listed behavioral irregularities beyond the polygraph results. Documentation included alcohol misuse during a training exercise, reliability concerns raised by instructors, and incidents of inappropriate conduct that individually might have been dismissed as minor lapses in judgment. Collectively, they formed a profile that contradicted the psychological stability required for Moscow station operations. Howard's supervisors documented each incident according to CIA personnel protocols, creating an administrative record that would later be examined during post-defection damage assessments. The Directorate of Operations faced a decision that carried significant institutional and personal consequences. Howard had completed months of specialized training. He had been briefed on operational methods, asset handling procedures, and technical capabilities specific to Moscow Station. He possessed detailed knowledge of CIA operations in the Soviet Union's most heavily monitored city. Revoking his assignment meant acknowledging that the selection and training process had advanced an unsuitable candidate to an advanced stage and admission of institutional failure. The decision came in July of 1983. The CIA revoked Howard's Moscow posting days before his scheduled departure, an extremely rare reversal in an agency where assignments of this magnitude involved months of preparation and significant institutional investment. Personnel logs show Howard expressing anger and perceived humiliation during his final meetings with directorate supervisors. Declassified human resources notes record an officer showing resentment toward institution and making statements suggesting he felt betrayed by an organization he had served. His security access was systematically reduced, classified material was removed from his workspace, his access badges were downgraded to restrict entry to sensitive facilities. Administrative separation followed through standard CIA procedures for terminating officers who no longer met security requirements. By late 1983, Edward Lee Howard was a former CIA officer with advanced training, detailed operational knowledge, and profound resentment toward the institution that had rejected him. The combination would prove catastrophic. The officer trained for Moscow became a security risk before ever deploying. Dismissed in late 1983, Howard returned to New Mexico. He found employment in state government work, a position that provided income but represented a dramatic decline in status and purpose compared to his CIA career. For someone who had been selected for one of the agency's most prestigious overseas postings, the return to routine civilian employment carries psychological weight. The transition from elite intelligence officer to state bureaucrat was jarring, and Howard's behavior during this period reflected his struggle with the loss of identity and purpose. Austrian immigration logs from this period confirm multiple entries by Howard into Vienna entries without declared purpose or clear connection to legitimate employment. The logs show arrivals and departures spaced weeks apart, suggesting short visits rather than tourism or extended business travel. Vienna had served as a KGB operational hub throughout the Cold War, a neutral city where Soviet intelligence officers operated with relative freedom compared to Western capitals. The city's geographic position, legal neutrality, and established intelligence infrastructure made it ideal for clandestine meetings between Soviet handlers and Western sources. FBI analysis conducted after Howard's defection correlated his Vienna trips with known KGB First Chief Directorate operations active during the same period. Intelligence gained from later defector testimony and surveillance photography confirmed these trips represented Howard's first substantive meetings with Soviet handlers. The operational pattern was textbook: a disgruntled former intelligence officer with specialized knowledge making unexplained visits to a city known for hostile intelligence activity. The Vienna meetings established the initial relationship between Howard and Soviet intelligence, a relationship built on his detailed knowledge of CIA Moscow operations and his willingness to provide that knowledge in exchange for financial compensation and, eventually, safe haven. The timing was significant. Howard approached the KGB during the period immediately following his dismissal, when his anger was freshest, his financial situation most uncertain, and his knowledge most current. From the KGB's perspective, Howard represented an exceptional opportunity. A recently trained CIA officer with specific knowledge of Moscow station operations who was actively seeking contact rather than requiring recruitment through the slow, careful approach typically necessary for turning intelligence officers. The CIA had trained a Moscow officer, revoked his assignment under circumstances that guaranteed resentment, and then lost effective oversight of him during the period of highest vulnerability. No monitoring protocol tracked his international travel. No follow-up assessment verified his activities or associations. No counterintelligence flag was placed on his passport. The assumption, common throughout U.S. counterintelligence at the time, was that a terminated officer posed minimal risk once separated from classified access. That assumption was based on the theory that access drove value without current access to classified information. A former officer had limited intelligence to provide. That theory failed to account for the value of operational knowledge, tradecraft procedures, and specific details about CIA Moscow station operations, all of which remained accurate and exploitable years after an officer's separation. Howard possessed information about how the CIA operated in Moscow, what technical capabilities it employed, what recruitment methods it preferred, and what security vulnerabilities it accepted as necessary operational risks. The CIA lost oversight exactly when Howard entered his most vulnerable phase. In Moscow, the KGB maintained files on thousands of intelligence targets worldwide. Among them was Adolf Tolkachev, cryptonym CK Sphere, later redesignated CK Crown, a Soviet engineer working at the Scientific Research Institute of Aviation Equipment. To his colleagues, Tolkachev was a radar specialist focused on airborne systems for advanced Soviet fighters. To the CIA, he was the most valuable technical intelligence source the agency had ever recruited inside the Soviet Union. Tolkachev supplied detailed technical documentation on the N-007 radar system used in Soviet interceptors. He provided schematics and performance data on MiG-29 avionics information that allowed Western analysts to understand the capabilities and limitations of the Soviet Union's most advanced air superiority fighter. He delivered intelligence on the Zaslan radar system designed for the MiG-31, a long-range interceptor built specifically to counter American strategic bombers and cruise missiles. The technical specifications he provided included radar frequency ranges, detection capabilities, electronic countermeasure vulnerabilities, and performance limitations under various operational conditions. The value of this intelligence was measured not in thousands or millions, but in billions of dollars in research and development offsets. Every technical specification Tolkachev provided eliminated entire research programs the United States would otherwise have pursued. Every weakness he identified allowed American designers to engineer countermeasures at a fraction of the cost of blind development. Defense analysts estimated that Tolkachev's intelligence saved the United States between $2 and $5 billion in aerospace research costs, while simultaneously providing critical insights into Soviet air defense capabilities that shaped American strategic planning throughout the 1980s. CIA case files show that operational security around Tolkachev followed strict compartmentation protocols. Only a small number of officers knew his identity. Communication methods used advanced concealment techniques developed specifically for Moscow's hostile surveillance environment. Dead drop locations were rotated according to complex schedules designed to prevent pattern recognition by KGB counterintelligence. The operational security procedures were based on decades of experience operating against Soviet intelligence and represented the CIA's most sophisticated asset protection methods. The CIA believed its asset compartmentation was secure. Moscow Center's Counterintelligence Directorate, Line KR, had different information. In 1984, Edward Lee Howard began providing the KGB with operational details about CIA activities in Moscow. Declassified damage assessments confirm he disclosed information that allowed Soviet counterintelligence to narrow the search for penetrations within Soviet military and technical institutions. Howard had never deployed to Moscow Station. His assignment had been revoked before rotation, but his training had included detailed briefings on operational methods, surveillance environments, and communication protocols used in denied areas. Among the information Howard provided were details that enabled the KGB to identify patterns in CIA operations. He described the types of Soviet personnel the CIA targeted for recruitment technical specialists with access to military development programs. He explained the communication methods the CIA preferred for high-value assets in Moscow: dead drops rather than personal meetings, coded signals rather than direct contact. He detailed the operational security procedures that revealed, through their very existence, that the CIA was running a sensitive source in Moscow's aerospace sector. KGB case file on Trianon Tolkachev's designation in Soviet records lists compromising operational breach detected in mid-1985. Counterintelligence teams began systematic observation of individuals with access to the technical programs Tolkachev worked on. The investigation was methodical, careful, and informed by Howard's intelligence about CIA operational patterns. Surveillance detected anomalies in Tolkachev's movements, deviations from routine that suggested clandestine activity. A controlled confrontation followed. Tolkachev was arrested in June of 1985. His trial, conducted in secret under Soviet state security protocols, resulted in conviction for espionage. The execution was recorded in September of 1986. The collapse of a single Moscow asset signaled wider systemic exposure. At Yasenevo, the KGB's first chief directorate headquarters, analysts prepared psychological assessments of their new source. The evaluation of Edward Lee Howard, compiled from initial meetings and subsequent debriefings, noted technical skill, procedural fidelity, and valuable insight into CIA Moscow Station operations. Howard demonstrated detailed knowledge of surveillance detection techniques, asset communication protocols, and the operational assumptions that guided CIA activities in denied areas. His information was current, specific, and immediately actionable for Soviet counterintelligence purposes. The assessment also documented psychological volatility traits that required careful management. KGB officers understood that Western defectors presented operational opportunities but also significant risks. Historical cases had demonstrated that defectors motivated by grievance rather than ideology tended toward unpredictability. Ideological defectors, individuals who betrayed their countries based on political conviction, generally proved more stable and reliable. They possessed internal justification for their actions that provided psychological resilience. Grievance-driven defectors, by contrast, operated from anger, resentment, and perceived injustice emotional states that could shift unpredictably. Howard fit the grievance profile precisely, a technically capable officer driven by resentment rather than conviction. KGB psychological assessments noted that Howard blamed the CIA for destroying his career over what he considered minor infractions. He expressed no particular sympathy for Soviet ideology or political systems. His motivation was personal revenge combined with financial compensation. The KGB evaluation concluded, operative reliable if properly controlled. Moscow Center assigned specialized handlers to manage Howard. These officers, drawn from the first Chief Directorate's North American Operations Section, possessed expertise in running Western sources and understanding American cultural and psychological patterns. Their task was to maintain Howard's cooperation, extract maximum intelligence value, and prepare him for potential exfiltration if American counterintelligence moved to arrest him. The handlers operated with clear understanding that Howard represented both an opportunity and a liability. The handlers taught Howard operational methods adapted for the American surveillance environment techniques distinct from those used in Moscow, where KGB counterintelligence operated with near total control. In the United States, Howard needed tradecraft that accounted for FBI mobility, technical surveillance capabilities, and legal constraints that shaped how American counterintelligence operated. The training covered surveillance detection appropriate for American cities, communication methods that avoided patterns FBI analysts might recognize, and escape procedures designed for scenarios where arrest appeared imminent. The training was thorough and professional. Howard's KGB handlers understood that his value extended beyond the intelligence he had already provided. If he could be successfully exfiltrated to Moscow in the event of FBI investigation, his debriefings could continue indefinitely. The KGB invested in Howard's operational security with the same care the CIA had once invested in his Moscow station training. The irony was precise and complete. The service Howard had been trained to resist became the service that trained him to escape. In Washington, the investigation that would eventually identify Howard began with a defection that surprised both American and Soviet intelligence services. In August of 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer assigned to the 1st Chief Directorate's North American operations, walked into the U.S. Embassy in Rome and requested asylum. Yurchenko held the rank of colonel and had served in sensitive positions within Soviet intelligence, including a posting as chief of the KGB's 5th Department, which handled internal security and counterintelligence against American and British intelligence operations. Yurchenko's debriefing provided the CIA and FBI with details on multiple Soviet intelligence operations against the United States. The information was fragmentary. Yurchenko's knowledge was compartmented according to KGB operational security protocols, but it included references to active Soviet penetrations of American intelligence. Among the information Yurchenko disclosed was a description of a former CIA officer cooperating with Soviet intelligence. The description was incomplete. Yurchenko did not know Howard's name. He had not met Howard personally. His knowledge came from administrative references and overheard conversations within the 1st Chief Directorate. The operational details Yurchenko provided, however, allowed American counterintelligence to narrow the field considerably. The source was a former CIA officer, not a current one. The officer had been trained for Moscow operations but never deployed. The time frame of recruitment was recent, within the past 2 years. The officer had accessed information about CIA operations in Moscow despite never serving there. These parameters eliminated most recently separated CIA personnel and focused attention on a small group of candidates. The FBI's counterintelligence division began reviewing CIA personnel records for officers who fit this profile. The review was systematic and comprehensive, examining separation records, training histories, and assignment schedules. Edward Lee Howard emerged as the primary suspect by late summer of 1985. His personnel file showed Moscow station training, polygraph failure, administrative separation in 1983, and no subsequent overseas assignment. The profile matched Yurchenko's description with disturbing precision. The FBI initiated full counterintelligence investigation protocols, which included surveillance, financial record analysis, and background interviews with associates. Surveillance teams documented irregular financial patterns, unexplained income inconsistent with his employment history. Bank records showed deposits that Howard could not account for through legitimate sources. The amounts were significant, thousands of dollars appearing at irregular intervals, suggesting payment for services rather than employment income or investment returns. Field reports noted early surveillance detection behavior, driving patterns designed to expose or evade watchers, variations in routine that suggested operational training. Howard was not merely living as a civilian. He was actively preparing for scenarios that suggested he anticipated eventual detection and possible arrest. FBI analysts reviewing the surveillance footage recognized the patterns. Surveillance detection routes executed with professional competence. Evasive maneuvers that exploited gaps in coverage. Timing variations that tested the FBI's response capabilities. With the suspect identified, the challenge became proving espionage before escape. By September of 1985, the FBI placed Howard under restricted observation in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The surveillance was not an arrest. Federal prosecutors required additional evidence to support espionage charges under U.S. Code Title 18, Section 794, which governed classified information disclosure. The legal standard was high. Prosecutors needed proof that Howard had communicated classified information to a foreign power with intent to harm the United States. Surveillance alone was insufficient. The FBI needed evidence of meetings, communications, or financial transactions directly linked to espionage activity. The FBI's approach balanced the need for continuous monitoring against the legal and practical constraints of domestic surveillance. Unlike foreign intelligence services operating in authoritarian environments, the FBI operated under constitutional restrictions governing search, seizure, and surveillance of American citizens. Howard could not be detained without charge. His movements could be observed but not physically prevented. The surveillance had to remain covert to preserve operational effectiveness and avoid legal challenges that might compromise prosecution. FBI surveillance logs from this period document Howard's behavior in detail. Subject performing evasive maneuvers inconsistent with civilian travel. The reports describe repetitive driving routes characteristic of surveillance detection routes that included abrupt turns, highway exits followed immediately by re-entry, parking lot loops, and timing variations designed to force following vehicles into visible positions. Howard varied his departure times from his residence. He changed destinations unpredictably. He conducted what surveillance analysts recognize as mock surveillance detection routes, practice runs, executed with increasing sophistication. The surveillance teams faced a fundamental problem. Howard knew exactly what they were doing because he had been trained in the same methods. His CIA training had included extensive instruction on how intelligence services conducted surveillance and, consequently, how to detect and evade it. He understood FBI resource limitations, shift change patterns, and the physical constraints of maintaining covert observation in residential environments. He exploited each vulnerability systematically. Howard conducted evasive driving through Santa Fe's street grid, forcing surveillance vehicles to close distance or risk losing contact. He executed sudden stops that would expose following vehicles. He used commercial parking lots to identify surveillance positions. Each exercise taught him more about the FBI's capabilities and limitations. The surveillance teams documented each incident, but the operational reality was that Howard was learning faster than the FBI could adapt its coverage. The FBI expected compliance from a subject under investigation. The institutional assumption was that awareness of surveillance would deter escalation, that Howard, knowing he was watched, would recognize the futility of escape and cooperate with investigators. That assumption failed to account for Howard's psychology and training. Instead of complying, he treated the surveillance as an unintentional training environment. He rehearsed escape routes, he identified gaps in coverage, he refined timing. Every drive became a practice run for the eventual escape he was planning. A containment measure became an unintentional training environment. September 20th, 1985, 20:47 hours. Howard exits his residence through the rear door. FBI surveillance logs record the movement. Minutes later, Howard enters his vehicle with his wife, Mary. The surveillance team, positioned in vehicles at standard observation distances, notes the vehicle's departure and begins following according to established protocols. The vehicle moves through Santa Fe's residential streets at normal speed, obeying traffic signals and showing no immediate signs of evasion. What happens next represents one of the most effective applications of CIA training ever executed against American counterintelligence. As the vehicle rounds a curve on a darkened street, Howard executes a variant of a technique known in CIA tradecraft as the jack-in-the-box, a diversion maneuver designed to defeat visual surveillance. The technique requires precise timing, darkness, and a curve or obstruction that briefly breaks the surveillance team's line of sight. As the vehicle rounds the curve, Howard exits rapidly through the passenger door while his wife continues driving. A dummy, a crude mannequin, or bundled clothing positioned in advance is placed in the passenger seat to maintain the appearance of two occupants. The FBI surveillance team, following at a distance calculated to avoid detection by the subject, continues tracking the vehicle. Standard FBI surveillance doctrine at the time emphasized covert observation over close pursuit. The teams were trained to maintain distance sufficient to prevent the subject from detecting coverage, which meant accepting brief visual breaks during curves, traffic stops, or other routine obstructions. The doctrine was designed for typical criminal surveillance, not for monitoring a trained intelligence officer executing professionally taught evasion techniques. By the time the FBI realizes Howard is no longer in the car, he has disappeared into Santa Fe's darkness. The surveillance team maintains observation of the vehicle as it continues its route. Mary Howard drives to a restaurant, parks, and eventually reveals that Edward is no longer present. The FBI immediately initiates emergency protocols, roadblocks, airport notifications, and border alerts. The response is swift and comprehensive, but Howard has already gained the critical element in any escape: time. Border movement analysis, conducted in subsequent days, shows uncorrelated vehicle activity matching patterns, consistent with Howard's escape route. Evidence suggests he used a pre-positioned vehicle or received assistance from contacts established during his KGB relationship. He crosses into Mexico using methods that avoid standard checkpoint documentation, likely through remote border crossings where physical barriers were incomplete and surveillance was limited. The Mexican border in 1985 was far less secure than it would become in later decades, with long stretches of desert terrain monitored sporadically, if at all. From Mexico, Howard travels through multiple European transit points. Intelligence reports later suggest routes through Austria or Finland, both locations with established KGB logistical networks for exfiltrating sources. The journey likely involved multiple stops, document changes, and carefully orchestrated handoffs between different Soviet intelligence officers. By late October, intelligence reports confirm Howard's arrival in Moscow under KGB control. The confirmation comes through signals intelligence intercepts, defector reporting, and eventually through Soviet propaganda broadcasts. Howard appears on Soviet television in a carefully staged interview, confirming his defection and denouncing CIA practices. The CIA's own methods became the blueprint for the only successful escape by a CIA officer. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the damage assessment summary compiled in late 1985 lists compromised operational identities, multiple. The assessment, coordinated between the CIA's counterintelligence staff and the Defense Department's counterintelligence division, documents the scope of Howard's betrayal with bureaucratic precision. Each compromised operation is listed, categorized by severity, and analyzed for potential recovery options. The document is classified at the highest levels and distributed only to officials with operational need to know. Operational tradecraft details, the specific methods CIA officers used to communicate with assets in Moscow, were compromised. Howard's training had included instruction on surveillance detection routes, optimized for Moscow's street patterns, dead drop procedures using locations selected for their surveillance blind spots, and communication protocols that exploited specific vulnerabilities in KGB coverage. All of this information was now in Soviet hands, requiring complete revision of Moscow Station's operational methods. Asset identifiers, the patterns of behavior, and operational signatures that allowed the CIA to distinguish between different sources were exposed. Howard knew how the CIA selected recruitment targets in Moscow, what professional backgrounds were considered most valuable, and what personal vulnerabilities the CIA exploited during recruitment approaches. This information allowed Soviet counterintelligence to profile potential CIA sources and implement protective surveillance on vulnerable personnel. Surveillance methodologies, the technical and procedural approaches Moscow Station used to detect and evade KGB observation were revealed. The CIA had developed sophisticated techniques for determining when officers were under surveillance. methods for breaking surveillance without appearing to do so deliberately, and protocols for aborting operations when compromise seemed likely. Howard's knowledge of these methods allowed the KGB to adjust their surveillance techniques to counter CIA procedures. The Tolkachev program represented the most visible collapse, but declassified assessments indicate numerous other operations required complete reorganization. The damage assessment identifies at least 6 additional Soviet sources whose security was potentially compromised by Howard's information. Some of these sources were quietly withdrawn from operational activity. Others continued operating under enhanced security protocols. The specific details remain classified, but the pattern is clear. Howard's betrayal forced a fundamental restructuring of CIA operations in Moscow. Moscow Station's operational security protocols, developed over decades of experience operating in the world's most hostile counterintelligence environment, had to be rebuilt from fundamentals. Officers scheduled for Moscow assignments were reassigned or subjected to additional security screening. Communication systems were redesigned using new encryption methods and different operational assumptions. Dead drop locations were abandoned even if there was no specific evidence of compromise. The risk was too high to continue using locations that Howard might have known about or could have described to Soviet counterintelligence. The reorganization consumed thousands of staff hours and millions of dollars in operational costs. What began as one officer's defection reshaped Moscow Station for years. 1985 became known in intelligence circles as the Great Betrayal Summer, a convergence of 3 major counterintelligence failures that exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in American security structures. The breaches were independent, arising from separate motivations and exploiting different systemic weaknesses, but their simultaneous exposure created a crisis atmosphere in Washington that prompted congressional inquiry and institutional reform. In June, the FBI arrested John Walker, a former Navy warrant officer who had sold classified communications intelligence to the Soviet Union for 18 years. The investigation began when Walker's ex-wife, motivated by financial disputes and personal grievance, contacted the FBI with detailed information about his espionage activities. The subsequent investigation revealed that Walker had operated a family spy ring that included his son, brother, and a Navy friend. Together, they had compromised American naval communications encryption systems, submarine patrol data, and strategic nuclear targeting information. The Walker spy ring provided the Soviet Navy with the ability to decrypt American naval communications in real time, a capability that Soviet naval commanders described as invaluable. American submarine operations in the North Atlantic and Pacific, previously considered secure due to encrypted communications, were effectively transparent to Soviet intelligence throughout much of the 1970s and early 80s. The damage was assessed as catastrophic to American naval operations and required complete replacement of communications encryption systems across the fleet at a cost exceeding $1 billion. In November, Jonathan Pollard, a civilian intelligence analyst working for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, was arrested for passing classified information to Israel. Pollard's espionage was motivated by a combination of ideological sympathy for Israel and financial compensation. He was paid monthly stipends by his Israeli handlers, while simultaneously rationalizing his betrayal as supporting a U.S. ally. The rationalization was false. While Israel was a U.S. ally, Pollard's espionage represented a massive intelligence compromise. Pollard delivered thousands of classified documents covering U.S. intelligence capabilities against Soviet targets, satellite reconnaissance data, and information about American intelligence operations in the Middle East. Some of this information subsequently reached Soviet intelligence through Israeli Soviet intelligence channels. Israel maintained complex intelligence relationships with multiple powers, and information provided by Pollard became, in some cases, bargaining material in Israeli negotiations with Moscow. The full extent of damage from the Pollard case remains partially classified, but assessments indicate compromise of intelligence sources, methods, and capabilities across multiple theaters. Between these 2 cases, Edward Lee Howard escaped FBI surveillance and defected to Moscow. A Department of Defense counterintelligence bulletin from late 1985 listed Howard as third major breach confirmed in 1 year. Congressional inquiries followed immediately. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence initiated hearings examining counterintelligence failures across the intelligence community. Intelligence historians analyzing the period classified 1985 as the worst year in modern U.S. counterintelligence history. The three breaches shared no common operational connection, but they revealed systemic vulnerabilities: inadequate insider threat programs, insufficient monitoring of personnel with access to classified information, and institutional assumptions that American intelligence personnel would remain loyal, absent specific indicators of compromise. The convergence forced institutional recognition that counterintelligence had been subordinated to operational priorities. The intelligence community had focused extensively on collecting intelligence abroad while devoting insufficient resources to protecting against internal compromise. 3 independent breaches converged into a structural crisis. If you value fact-based Cold War history told with documentary precision, consider supporting Cold War Files by sharing this content with others interested in understanding the mechanisms and human failures that shaped intelligence operations during the Cold War. In Moscow, Howard's value to the KGB extended beyond the operational intelligence he had already provided. Soviet broadcast archives from the late 1980s show Howard appearing on television programs denouncing CIA policy. The appearances were carefully staged propaganda exercises designed to achieve multiple objectives: demonstrate Soviet intelligence success, undermine CIA credibility, and provide domestic audiences with a Western voice criticizing American foreign policy. Howard appeared comfortable in these roles, suggesting that his grievance toward the CIA remained strong enough to justify public betrayal. The propaganda value was significant. A former CIA officer criticizing American intelligence operations while residing in the Soviet Union provided Moscow with a powerful narrative tool. Howard described CIA training methods, criticized agency personnel policies, and portrayed himself as a victim of institutional injustice. The narrative fit Soviet propaganda themes, portraying Western intelligence services as ruthless organizations that discarded officers who failed to meet arbitrary standards. Soviet media presented Howard as a whistleblower rather than a traitor, a framing that served both propaganda purposes and Howard's own psychological need for justification. KGB files declassified after the Cold War reveal that Howard's actual role in Moscow was more constrained than his public appearances suggested. He provided technical insights during debriefings that continued intermittently for several years after his arrival. He consulted on CIA operational methods, offering Soviet counterintelligence officers detailed explanations of American training procedures, recruitment approaches, and institutional culture. He helped Soviet intelligence understand how CIA officers thought, what operational assumptions they made, and what cultural factors influenced their decision-making. But Howard did not conduct operational fieldwork. The KGB maintained strict surveillance over Howard, limiting his movements and associations. He lived in a KGB-provided apartment, received a state stipend, and existed under continuous observation by security services. The arrangement was protective but also restrictive. Howard was valuable for what he knew, not for what he could do in active operations. His psychological instability, documented in both CIA and KGB evaluations, made him unsuitable for active operations that required judgment, discipline, and reliability under stress. The assessment was pragmatic and entirely consistent with how intelligence services manage defectors. Howard was granted protection and financial support but kept under continuous observation. He was allowed limited social interaction and carefully monitored contact with other Westerners in Moscow. The KGB's approach reflected their evaluation. Howard was a compromised asset whose ongoing value lay primarily in historical debriefing rather than active employment. His knowledge degraded over time as the CIA adapted its methods and personnel rotated through new assignments. By the early 1990s, Howard's intelligence value had largely expired. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created additional complications for Howard's status. The KGB was dissolved and reorganized into successor agencies, including the FSB for domestic security and the SVR for foreign intelligence. Howard's case file transferred to the SVR, but his operational value remained minimal. He was a relic of the Cold War, living in a country that no longer resembled the Soviet state he had defected to. In Moscow, Howard gained protection, not trust. Edward Lee Howard lived in Russia for 17 years following his defection. He resided in a controlled environment, an apartment provided by the state, in a compound used for foreign residents with special status. His movements were monitored by security services according to protocols established for managing defectors and other individuals whose presence in Russia served intelligence purposes. The level of surveillance was less intrusive than active counterintelligence observation, but more comprehensive than ordinary police monitoring. Howard performed limited consultancy roles during his years in Moscow, primarily technical analysis related to his CIA training and knowledge of American intelligence procedures. KGB officers and later FSB officers, the successor service after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, occasionally consulted him on questions about CIA methods, American intelligence culture, or specific operational questions where his experience remained relevant. These consultations became less frequent over time as his knowledge became dated and the intelligence environment evolved beyond the Cold War structures he had known. No evidence from declassified files or defector testimony indicates Howard returned to active intelligence work beyond the initial debriefings that followed his arrival in Moscow. By the mid-1990s, Howard's value to Russian intelligence had effectively expired. The CIA had long since revised the operational methods he had compromised. Moscow Station operated under entirely different protocols. The officers Howard had known were retired or reassigned. His knowledge was historical rather than operational. On July 19, 2002, Russian police filed a report listing cause of death as accidental fall. Howard had been found at his dacha, a small country house outside Moscow, with injuries consistent with a fall downstairs. The report indicated he had been alone at the time of death. The circumstances were investigated as routine, a 61-year-old man living alone in a rural property experiencing a fatal accident. Russian authorities conducted a standard investigation, found no evidence of foul play, and closed the case. Some observers questioned whether the death was genuinely accidental. Howard's knowledge, while dated by 2002, still represented a potential liability if he chose to redefect or provide information to Western intelligence services. The KGB's successor service, the FSB, maintained protocols for managing former assets who no longer served operational purposes, but whose continued existence posed theoretical risks. The question of whether Howard was eliminated by Russian intelligence remains unanswered by available evidence. No witness testimony contradicts the official account. No forensic analysis suggested foul play. No conclusive evidence supports any theory beyond the official report. What remains documented is that Edward Lee Howard, the only CIA case officer ever to defect successfully to the Soviet Union, died in isolation 17 years after his escape. He lived those years under restrictions that provided physical safety but denied meaningful freedom. He never returned to the United States. He never reconciled with family or former colleagues. His defection provided him with escape from prosecution, but not with the professional purpose or personal satisfaction he had sought as a CIA officer. The defector who evaded two agencies could not escape isolation. In the years following Howard's defection, the United States intelligence community initiated comprehensive reforms to address the vulnerabilities his case exposed. The reforms were developed through multiple channels: congressional oversight committees examining counterintelligence failures, internal intelligence community working groups analyzing systemic weaknesses, and interagency task forces developing new protocols for insider threat detection. The result was a fundamental restructuring of how American intelligence services approached personnel, security, and counterintelligence. A congressional report from the mid-1990s stated, "Insider threat remains dominant counterintelligence challenge. The assessment reflected institutional recognition that the greatest risks to American intelligence came not from external penetration but from individuals with authorized access who chose betrayal." The statistic was stark. Throughout the Cold War, damage from insider threats exceeded damage from all other forms of espionage combined. Foreign intelligence services rarely penetrated American institutions directly. Instead, they recruited or exploited Americans who already possessed access. Polygraph protocols were revised to include more sophisticated psychological assessment techniques. The traditional polygraph examination focused narrowly on specific questions about unauthorized disclosure, foreign contacts, and criminal activity. The revised protocols incorporated broader behavioral assessment, psychological evaluation, and analysis of stress factors that might indicate vulnerability to recruitment or compromise. The assumption that polygraph failure automatically indicated deception was replaced with more nuanced evaluation methods that accounted for stress responses, examiner variability, and the documented limitations of polygraph technology. Clearance review procedures were strengthened to include continuous evaluation rather than periodic renewal. The traditional model grant clearance based on background investigation, conduct minimal monitoring, renew every 5 years was replaced with systems designed to detect behavioral changes, financial irregularities, and personal stresses that might indicate vulnerability during the years between formal reviews. Credit monitoring, travel tracking, and behavioral assessment became standard components of ongoing clearance management rather than episodic renewal events. Travel monitoring for personnel with access to sensitive compartmented information was enhanced significantly. The gap that allowed Howard to travel to Vienna without triggering counterintelligence review was closed through automated systems that flagged foreign travel by individuals with specific types of access. The systems integrated data from passport control, airline manifests, and customs declarations to create comprehensive travel profiles. Unexplained travel to locations associated with hostile intelligence activity triggered automatic security review. New insider threat programs were established across the intelligence community. These programs integrated personnel security, counterintelligence, and information security functions to identify potential risks before they evolved into active breaches. The programs used behavioral analysis, peer reporting systems, and automated monitoring of classified information systems to detect patterns suggesting disaffection, financial stress, or unauthorized activity. The goal was early intervention, identifying vulnerable personnel, and providing support, counseling, or additional security measures before compromise occurred. Edward Lee Howard remains the only CIA case officer ever to defect successfully to the Soviet Union. Multiple CIA officers were convicted of espionage during and after the Cold War, but Howard alone managed to escape American custody and reach Moscow. The reforms his betrayal prompted represent the intelligence community's effort to ensure that operational failure would not recur through the same vulnerabilities. The reforms were expensive, administratively burdensome, and resisted by operational elements concerned about constraints on mission effectiveness. They were also necessary. The cost of prevention, however high, remained lower than the cost of another catastrophic insider breach. One breach forced an entire reevaluation of how the United States protects its own institutions. If you value factual Cold War history based on real documents and declassified records, please like this video, subscribe to Cold War Files, and let me know in the comments which Cold War spy or operation you'd like covered next.